My name is Maxwell Spenzana. I lead the Humanitarian Emergency Affairs for World Vision in Southern Africa.
Morning, colleagues. My name is Samuel Ngaira, IFRC Pretoria Cluster Delegation, Disaster Management, and a bit of migration as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Morena, can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Morena Mukuti. I've been actually part of FSNWG from the beginning. So yeah, from when it started. So I work for IFAD now, but at the time I was working for OCHA. So now I'm with one of the RDAs, IFAD.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, let's have a look at our agenda for today. It's quite a packed agenda, as you have noticed. And our focus for this meeting is on the El Nino, the forecasted El Nino. As you know from our recent retreat, we really want to bring in a strong early warning component to food security, agriculture, and nutrition within the FNSWG. And our focus for today is mainly on the impacts of the El Nino by different sector. We're going to start off with an update from FuseNet. Then we're going to move into a more focused analysis on the probable impacts of the El Nino on food security and agriculture based on historical data and what we are likely to see in the coming months. We're also going to have the Anticipatory Action Working Group give us an update on their readiness in terms of how many anticipatory action protocols are there to be activated in case the trigger for drought is reached. We have our usual nutrition update from UNICEF and WFP, and the FuseNet and WFP updates on prices and markets. We have a very new innovative presentation today from UNFPA on GBV mitigation in the context of drought. And we're going to be introducing our new nominated co-chair as we close this month's meeting. So on this note, I'm going to ask if there are any AOBs, if partners that want to talk to any AOBs. If not, then I will hand over to FuseNet. But do we have any other business that any partners that want to talk to? You can just put up your hands and then we will take note. Yeah. Okay, colleagues, I think on that note, we will hand over to FuseNet for the climate update. I'm not sure if it's Pam or Tamuka that we have, but over to you. Okay. All right. No one's online for FuseNet. Okay. It seems as if we don't have anyone from FuseNet online as yet. I think we can start with the next agenda item, which is then the impacts of the El Nino on agriculture and food security.
Q, I'll quickly check on Tamuka. Imran Ned here. I'll quickly check on Tamuka and get back to you.
All right, thank you, Imran.
Thanks.
But we will just proceed with the next agenda item in the meantime.
Sure.
Okay. All right, colleagues. So let's start with the next agenda item, which is the impacts on food security and agriculture and any readiness activities that you are starting as partners. Next slide. So colleagues, as you know, we have the El Nino that has been forecasted for this season in Southern Africa. And what we know for sure is that drier conditions are generally observed across Southern Africa whenever we have a forecasted El Nino. I know you've seen this map several times, but maybe just to draw your attention to Southern Africa, where you can see it's shaded in brown, giving us the message that below average rains often lead to prolonged dry spells and drought in most of our countries in the region. And this is really a cause for concern, and we are encouraging countries and partners now to map which areas specifically at the local level would be affected severely by the potential forecasted dryness. Looking at the impact of El Nino in Southern Africa, see for next slide. And if you've probably seen the ENSO graphs or the ENSO forecasts, you know that the impact of El Nino in Southern Africa is the strongest during our growing season, where we have widespread drier conditions than average, which leads to lower vegetation growth across the region. Looking back at historical data, there is a moderate correlation between the occurrence of El Nino events and a decrease in crop production. We had very, very strong El Nino events in 1982, 1983, 1997, 1998, and I'm sure you all remember the 2015, 2016 El Nino, which was very strong and actually demonstrated up to 50% loss in agricultural production in that year. But what is important to note that no two El Nino events are ever the same. The signal strength of El Nino does not always correspond to the magnitude of its impacts, right? So what this really means is that you can have a high probability of the El Nino, as we've seen now, it's close to 90%, but it could be a weak El Nino, it could be a strong El Nino, it could be a very strong El Nino. And the strength of the El Nino would only be made clear to us by climate scientists, I think, by July and August, when the reliability of the different forecasting information becomes stronger. So we need to wait to properly understand what the strength of the El Nino would be. However, it is important to plan ahead, to be prepared, to have your anticipatory approaches and triggers and plans ready to mitigate the risk, and always follow a no-regret approach if needed. We have an example here of the 2015-2016 major El Nino event. In our history, in Southern Africa's record, it was the most intense drought event, the 2015-2016 El Nino. It had a return period of around 200 years. So you can imagine how strong that event really was. There were severe impacts on localized food security, livelihoods, and different sectors in the economy. In Southern Africa alone, more than 32 million people were food insecure across the region, compared to 60 million globally that were in need of urgent assistance at this particular point in time. If we look now more closely at the correlation between vegetation conditions and cropland, what you would see, this graph, this map is actually depicting the correlation between El Nino and vegetation conditions in cropland areas to give us a sense of the effects of rainfall deviations under El Nino conditions. It highlights the correlation between the agricultural stress index and El Nino oscillation and the El Nino basically over cropland areas. So it looks at the NDVI and the impacts of the El Nino or the water stress that crops experience during this time. So the orange and red colors that you can actually see in this map infer stressed vegetation conditions due to water scarcity, right? While the greener areas represent more healthy vegetation conditions. That is more reflective of above normal rainfall due to the El Nino effect, but in other regions. So this map really shows you water stressed, the impact on agriculture due to water stress. And what we want to really draw your attention to is the darker orange colors that you will see mostly in Southern Africa, parts of South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, and Namibia, right, that had significant impacts. And this next map actually shows you agricultural areas with high correlation between dry or wet conditions and the El Nino event, and the main cereals during the different phases of the crop cycle during months with the most historical impact. And so basically this map narrows down the analysis, showing you cropland areas with statistically significant correlation between severe water stress and El Nino events. What is important to note here is that in Southern Africa, the entire crop cycle is affected by drier than average weather conditions. Water deficits could curtail planting and final yield, with compounding negative effects on final production. So you can actually see this map. It's a very nice map that was done by FAO's early warning unit. You can actually see the different stages of crop growth that would be affected. In Southern Africa, you see the three colors, the orange, the green, and the yellow. So water stress is likely to occur during the ripening through the harvest phase, right? Where there's low sensitivity to water stress, through the vegetative to reproductive stage, where there's strong sensitivity to water stress, and from the planting to the early vegetative stage, where there is a moderate sensitivity to water stress. The next slide gives you a bit of historical analysis. But what we really want to zone in on in this map is the table that you see below, where you see the highest impact on farm areas or on hectares, and the period in which you see the highest impact of the below average rains. As we know, the peak impact on crops is between December, January, February. This is the key period of the maize crop cycle in Southern Africa. And you can see the percentage of cropland that was actually affected through this historical analysis. Lesotho, almost 100% of the cropland was affected. Botswana, 51%. We have Namibia with highest impacts on cropland as well, followed by Eswatini and Zimbabwe. So most of our countries in Southern Africa really are at high risk, not just looking at historical data, but also looking from a more forward perspective, as you will see in the coming slides. The next slide just summarizes the countries that are at risk for highest impacts of the El Nino, not only from an agricultural perspective, from a compounding shock perspective. If you look at the countries highlighted in red, these countries actually have several other issues going on right now. They have protracted food crisis. If you look at Madagascar, it has an ongoing drought. Malawi had a severe socioeconomic crisis most recently, plus the devastating impacts of tropical cyclone Freddy. Zimbabwe's ongoing economic crisis, inflation, ongoing seriously high inflation levels, and Mozambique, where you have conflict, severe flooding, and bouts of dry spells this last season. But other countries should also be kept in mind, including Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, Eswatini, and Zambia. But the four in red, we should know have protracted ongoing crises, in addition to this forecasted El Nino and the agricultural shock that could impact these countries. In terms of preparing for the El Nino, we should all be aware that the potential production declines do represent a threat to food insecurity in our region, where the prevalence of food insecurity is already high. Lower harvests could result in reduced food availability and income earning opportunities for vulnerable households. Several countries in these regions are suffering from multiple shocks, as I already said. Economic instability due to low economic growth, unsustainable debt levels, foreign exchange shortages, which have contributed to high inflation levels. In the event of a production shock, this economic instability could pose challenges for countries to increase needed imports. Therefore, it is important for us to be prepared as the humanitarian community. We need to have our anticipatory action protocols ready to be triggered in most countries at risk especially where food insecurity is already quite high. In addition, partners should be ready to implement agricultural and livelihood-based interventions in coordination with government and humanitarian partners to prepare for the forecast. Some of these impacts that we are talking about, what are they really? If we look at the next slide, these are the potential impacts on agriculture and food security and some of the possible mitigation measures that we can package into effective response options or response programs. We all know there's delayed start to the rains or late planting. There's poor crop performance. There's delayed tillage. There's drying of community water points, including streams and boreholes and dams. There's increased temperatures, which result in a lot of stress for plants at different stages of growing, as I mentioned. There's increased risk of bushfires. There's reduced availability of cropland, pastures or rangeland for livestock. And there's increased livestock mortality because of the drying up of pastures and water points. There's increased and often unregulated movement of people, livestock, and wildlife as they search for water and pasture, which increases the risk of outbreaks of transboundary pests and diseases. There's drying up of aquaculture, fish habitats, and overall poor production and declines across different sectors within agriculture itself. And if we recall from the El Nino 2015-2016, the impacts on food insecurity are also multiplied. If we remember, there was increased use of food coping strategies and livelihood coping strategies, increased acute malnutrition that we saw amongst vulnerable household members, particularly children under 5. I think those impacts are still fresh in our memories. And this is why we are really encouraging partners and ourselves as a community to be ready. The last slide talks to the recommended anticipatory actions because we really need to act before the hazard reaches its peak, not only at the end where we see an accumulation of all the impacts across different sectors. We really need to act now, be prepared now, and act before this potential drought reaches its peak. I am not going to go through all of these points because I've mentioned them in the previous slide. But what I do want to highlight is that what makes a difference is the timing of these actions. We can package them as response options at the end where we see the peak impacts of the drought, or we can anticipate and act before we see the peak impacts. And so the timing of when we act plays a very important role in protecting livelihoods of the most vulnerable households in our region. On that note, that's the end of this presentation. Before we move on to the next agenda item, let us check if Tamuka's online or Pam. Okay, no one's online yet. No one has managed to Okay, colleagues, I don't think we are still waiting for our FuseNet colleagues to join, but are there any questions or comments on the presentation on the impacts? Okay. Charlene, please go ahead.
Thank you. Many thanks. I just needed a clarification on one of the slides. I think it was showing the type of crops in each of the regions, and it was highlighting like a time period, November to March. I did not quite get what the slide was saying. I don't know if you can go back to that slide.
Is it this one?
Yes, this one. What are we saying on this slide? I didn't quite get it.
Okay, this slide. Did you want to add?
No, really, I did not quite understand the explanation. Are we saying the information we have is for the period November to March?
Oh, I see.
Oh, yes, what especially for some parts of Southern Africa. I did not quite get the meaning of the slide.
Okay, I think there are basically two meanings that this two messages the slide is giving. The first message it's giving is that where you see areas that are highlighted in red in Southern Africa with these patches of red, it means that these areas have usually historically had a serious water deficit, right? It means there was not enough water to support different stages of crop growth, right? And then what it means also is that in Southern Africa, our typical growing season or our typical agricultural season is from November to March, right? But if you look at specific countries, it could be October to March. But here the message is that between October to March, during our peak growing season, there is likely to be a water deficit that could affect our maize, the growing of maize, throughout its different growth stages, from ripening through to the harvest phase.
Okay, great. Many thanks.
Okay, thanks. Okay, colleagues, you're also free to put in comments in the chat or questions in the chat, and then we would aim to answer those. All right. In the interest of time.
Hello. Yeah,
Hello.
one quick one. Since I recently joined, I met with some of the UN agencies here, also in Zimbabwe, Harare. And some of the information which was coming through that in terms of the food production this year, though the quantity was not yet clear, but the information which was coming that this year the food production is significantly higher than the last year. So how you correlate that with this drought sort of condition moving forward? Because from the anticipatory action or being prepared for some sort of response, they need to have those balances also. That if there is enough food, then maybe there might be water or some other related intervention might be needed, but not the food one. So any thoughts around that? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your question. I think this graph that you are seeing is actually based on historical data from recorded ENSO events. I'm not sure how many events that they have actually captured to generate this analysis, but last year, this previous season that we are coming out of was a La Nina event. So I don't think that they would the previous season was actually captured when they were generating when this map was actually generated. But going forward, based on the crop assessment that you've mentioned, it states that there's a significant surplus in Zimbabwe, as you mentioned, and the interventions that may be needed. There may be surplus carryover stocks within the country at this particular point in time that may not affect availability as such, right? But what we are likely to see going forward in Zimbabwe from now, from October until March next year, is that a poorly performing agricultural season. While this previous season performed well, you have surplus stocks that could carry households over and maybe cushion food insecurity for a while. This next season is likely to be poor, and a lot of the activities that actually happen during the season, like agricultural labor opportunity that poor households depend on, that could be reduced, which means that there will be low income or reduced income for those very poor households that usually depend on agricultural labor. It would be interesting to see, based on the surplus that was recorded in Zimbabwe this previous season, how many months that stocks could actually last throughout the following season. But we haven't done that analysis at country level, but we could also have a bilateral on that. The message is that this coming agricultural season could be worse. It could be cushioned by the positive previous season. But impacts could be not so good on poorer agricultural households and farmers generally, especially looking forward to, the next year.
Just to add.
Yes, please go.
So to add to what Q has just highlighted, indeed, a surplus, it helps particularly at national level, because most of these households do not just use the surplus for food. They also sell a bit of that to cover some of their costs, which means that what they sell or what they keep is not always enough for the next season, depending on how much they needed to sell to send children to school, to go to a clinic, or to cover any other costs. But certainly, I think, as Q pointed out earlier, that in terms of the anticipatory action, those that are done by humanitarian organizations or by the national governments may tend to be late, which therefore means that the households have to be told or made aware of the upcoming risk, so that where they are able to save as much as possible from the current harvest or the harvest from the previous season, they do so, but also that they plan appropriately for the next season. For instance, the example of the short season varieties, then they would need to pay or to purchase short season varieties as they sell some of those crops. So it has to be an effort at household level, at national level, and also from the humanitarian organizations. Thank you.
Thanks as well. Okay. Colleagues, right, we can move on. And I think we have Pam online now from FuseNet. So we will just quickly go through the climate update. Pam, over to you.
Hi Q, hi everyone, thank you. Apologies, I got the times mixed up. The climate update is quite brief, so I'll just go ahead and go through that. Thanks, Sipho. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this basically shows the seasonal precipitation for this ending season. So this is CHIRP's data for the period October to 30 April. And from this image, we can clearly see some of the poorly performing areas in the central and eastern parts of the region, including southern and western Zimbabwe, much of Botswana, and in particular the northwestern parts of Botswana, much of Namibia, southern Angola, as well as southwestern Zambia, and then eastern Madagascar, which also received below average rainfall for this season. And a lot of these areas actually recorded not only extended dry periods, but there were also above average temperatures, which exacerbated the moisture deficits in these areas. And so these are the areas that will likely see poor production outcomes this season. And then in contrast, you have the eastern parts of the region, which recorded above average rainfall. And in these areas, it's largely attributed to the passage of tropical cyclones, particularly in southern Malawi, central Mozambique, as well as southern Mozambique, and southwestern Madagascar, which are some of the areas which were most affected by cyclonic impacts. Next slide, please. So here we have the water requirement satisfaction index, which is based on rainfall. And again, these poor performing areas here are highlighted in the center and western parts of the region. So this is the WRSI for maize. And then we can actually see that in some of the areas, including northern Botswana and parts of Namibia, rainfall in these areas was so low that the model didn't classify it as a start of season. Rather, the water recorded was not enough to support crop growth in these areas. So we can see these areas presented in light pink, and we can also see some poor performance presented in the purple and orange colors. So this basically mirrors the rainfall image, and we can actually see the poor performing areas as well as the surplus performing areas. Maybe one thing to note is that we are aware of some of the flooding impacts in some of the cyclone impacted areas. So WRSI unfortunately doesn't show impact of flooding and other aspects which may impact crop conditions. So in some of the areas such as southern Malawi, we see surplus WRSI or positive WRSI, but and then in southern Malawi, for example, we see average or good WRSI indications, but we know that some of these areas were impacted by flooding and crop production was ultimately also impacted. Next slide, please. Once again, just a summary of conditions. This is the normalized difference vegetation index. Basically shows the vegetation conditions for the region. So the first one on the left is for the first, or rather second decade of March, and the second on the right is for the first decade of May. And just comparing these two images, we see that some of these areas actually recorded some improvement in vegetation conditions, such as southern Mozambique, and parts of Angola, and as well as southern DRC. This is actually attributed to some good rains which were received in the past month or so in these areas. And then we also have some deterioration of conditions in other areas, such as in South Africa, Botswana, and Mozambique. So in some of these areas, we've actually seen a sort of plateauing of the rainfall cumulative graph, which might indicate an early cessation of rainfall in these areas, which obviously doesn't benefit areas which were counting on some of the last rains in the season. Next slide, please. So this is, sorry, this basically summarizes, this is a snapshot from the most recent GeoGlam report, which a lot of us may be familiar with. So this basically summarizes what GeoGlam expects in terms of crop production in the region. And again, some of those central and western areas are expecting below average crop production. There's not much else to add to that. Next slide, please. So I think Q may have gone over this. I joined late. I'm sorry if I'm repeating some of the information. But basically, this is so the graph on the right shows a plume of the various models that the IRI uses, and we can see that most of the models are showing sea surface temperature anomalies above 0.5, which classifies as an El Nino conditions. And then the graph on the right then sort of uses an ensemble of various models to come up with the ENSO probabilities. And looking at the start of our main season in the Southern Africa region, which is about SON, OND, we can see that probabilities are setting at 90% for El Nino, for an El Nino phase during that period, and it's actually expected to continue into early next year, 2024. So yeah, just to re-emphasize that El Nino conditions are the most likely for the coming season. Next slide, please. Yeah, Q may have presented something similar to this, but this is an impressive presentation by the Climate Hazard Center in collaboration with NOAA. Basically shows the likely impacts of the El Nino, likely impacts on precipitation in the El Nino phase. And we see that in Southern Africa, as we know, the most likely impacts are reduced rainfall in our region, particularly during our main growing season, which is October to April. Yeah, trying to avoid repetition of information, I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thanks, Pam. Let's see if there are any questions. Any questions for Pam on the climate update?
Jones.
Jones? Yeah. Jones, go ahead.
Thank you, Pam. A very quick question. Is it possible to tell whether there will be a mild or a very strong El Nino for the 23-24 production season? Thank you.
Thanks, Jones.
Thanks, Jones. At this point, there's not much strong confidence, but as we get closer to the season, we might be able to, because the El Nino forecast is obviously based on sea surface temperature anomalies, and the better we can forecast those anomalies, then the greater the confidence of that particular phase that we will have. So at this point, my answer would be the confidence wouldn't be that great, but the signals will be much stronger as we go. We get closer to the season, and the graph that I showed, which shows 90% probabilities. How do I say this? But basically, my answer would be the confidence gets even closer in terms of whether it is a stronger or weaker ENSO phase. It gets stronger as we get into the season. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Pam.
Okay, great.
Thanks. Okay, I think there are no more questions. Thank you, Pam, for that update. And just to reiterate the message that Pam gave in her presentation, that the probabilities are increasing, and the probabilities are increasing during our peak agricultural season, just necessitating us to get the message out there and to start preparing for the possible impacts that we may see in the coming agricultural season. Our next agenda item then is from the ROG, the Anticipatory Action Working Group.
just one slide.
Okay. All right. So we have been talking a lot about anticipatory action as part of the FNSWG. And there is a separate working group on anticipatory action. It's called the Regional Anticipatory Action Working Group. But what we are profiling here is the readiness and the anticipatory component in preparation for the forecasted El Nino. And this working group has embarked on a mapping exercise. And what you are looking at is actually a mapping of all the protocols. It's not an updated map. The map is, we are currently collecting information, right?
We should have an updated one by Thursday.
Okay, we would have an updated map by Thursday, but this is the current situation for now, for the next 2 days. It basically shows you areas or partners that have anticipatory action protocols that are ready to be activated in case of the confirmation of the El Nino and in case triggers are reached. In summary, there are 20 active anticipatory action protocols throughout the region and 9 that are under development. But by Thursday, I think this number would go significantly higher because partners have been sending in information in little pieces. But if you do have information, if you do have an anticipatory action protocol that's ready and validated, or one that's under development that could be triggered this coming season, please send Sipokazi your information, or just get in touch with Sipokazi, because on behalf of the Anticipatory Action Working Group, she is leading this exercise on behalf of the Anticipatory Action Working Group. So this is an overview of where we stand now, and this will be presented at the RIASCO on Thursday as well, but the updated version. Any questions on this additions? No. Anyone online, Sipo?
Comment. Okay, this is the Bulisani, the hand up.
Go ahead, Bulisani.
Yes, thank you so much. A quick one on the anticipatory action. The organizations that are listed there, if they have the protocols, does it mean they have funding available for responding in case the El Nino is confirmed? Thank you.
Yes, when we undertook the mapping exercise, we did ask partners to highlight whether funding was attached to the protocol, how much of funding, and the sector that the protocol addresses, whether it's nutrition, food security, or whether it's cross-cutting, and whether any stocks have been pre-positioned as part of this anticipatory action protocol. So talking from a FAO's perspective, I can say that yes, when we talk of having a validated anticipatory action protocol, it does come with funding. And I guess it's the same for World Vision.
Yeah, so World Vision, we have a National Emergency Preparedness and Response Fund, which gets topped up at the end of our fiscal year, that's end of September. So which means that at that point, we have a threshold, say, for $600,000 for high-risk countries, but maybe $400,000 for medium-risk countries and $200,000 for low-risk countries. As the year progresses, there would be different shocks that occur, and a part of that is used for that particular shock. But yes, what we is presented has some funding associated with that. And that funding obviously is not enough to address all the issues, but it is sufficient for, say, rapid assessments, but then also maybe documentation of what the situation is, and hoping to then leverage on it to mobilize additional funding.
Thank you. I think so far in the Mapping Start Network, WHH, World Vision, FAO, WFP, as well as IFRC have indicated the amount of funds per
Okay.
country that they have, that they can put towards anticipatory action protocols. So they should have a breakdown of that as well. There's some comments in the chat. Just to answer one, Charlene is asking if we can share, if partners can share their anticipatory action protocols if possible. I think I can, in the email that comes after the meeting, I can share some resources where partners can access anticipatory action protocols and look through them. And then there's a question also from Bulisani asking, I think it's to the climate team. Is it possible to get WRSI for small grains such as sorghum and millet?
Okay. On the question on the protocols and sharing of the protocols, yes, Sipho Kazi would be happy to share that information with you. And if you want to contribute to the mapping exercise, Sipho will also send you the link to the matrix that you can fill in. And on the WRSI, my understanding is that it's only available for maize, and that FuseNet has the WRSI. It's representative for maize, actually. So we can find out for you.
Hi,
If
Q.
they are. Hi, Pam, you are there, so please go ahead.
Sorry. So on the FuseNet website, there's only WRSI for maize, but on the actual WRSI platform, you can actually change the crops, and we do have sorghum and millet available. But yeah, either me or Tamuka would have to help Bulisani with getting that product because it's not available on the website. So Bulisani, you're welcome to send me an email.
Thank you.
I'll drop my email below. Thanks.
Comment from
Thank you.
There's another comment from Pierre. It's saying recovery of hydrological droughts takes much more time than for agricultural drought. Can someone share a study on groundwater recharge in relation to the precipitations in ESOL?
Okay. So that request, Pierre, we will put out to the FNSWG partnership on your specific request.
That's it.
Okay. We don't have anything handy, but it's a very good question and a very technical one. So we will put out a request for any studies and share it with you when they become available. And we will link up Pam with Bulisani so he can get the WRSI for millet and other small grains as well. Thank you for those interesting questions. So, colleagues, we can now move on to our next agenda item, which is the markets and trade update from FuseNet and WFP. Jones, I guess you are leading this one?
Yes, Kyo. And good morning, colleagues. I just want to take you through the latest food price index, the global FAO food price index, the current situation, and also share with you the last marketing year figures to show where we are coming from. Then share the trade flow patterns that we have been experiencing these last few months, and also share some bit of production trends to show the importance of carryover stocks and also the importance of trade. Next slide, please. So in terms of the food price index, we have seen a rebound of the index after several months of sliding prices. We are near 20% below the values of last year. We're looking at the left charts, specifically the red graph for 2023. We can see from this graph that in the last month, the index is rebounded. It's being driven, this rebound is driven by increases in the sugar index, which is reflected in the chart on the right. But basically, we are way below 2022 levels, but still above the pre-COVID price levels, which indicates that globally, stocks are very tight and prices remain high. We're better than what the situation we had in 2022. So the graph on the right shows the sub indices for cereals, which went down 1.7% from March to April. And this was driven by decreases in the prices of wheat. We have good availability in Australia as well as the Russian Federation, and good cropping conditions in Europe. So supply of wheat is very good, and prices are coming down. Grain prices, maize grain prices also fell from March to April, thanks to the record harvest that are expected in Brazil. Supplies will be improving. The only surprise is with rice. Rice prices firmed in April because of stepped up demand. And we also recall we had very serious floods in Pakistan. The vegetable price index has also been coming down because of stable prices of palm oil and average demand for the other oilseed products. So the main message here is that supplies remain tight on a seasonal basis. Yes, prices are low, but the climate change shocks are not the only shocks we are having to deal with globally. We have reduced production in Ukraine. We also have sanctions on Russian trade and the related export restrictions from that war area, the Black Sea area. We are aware we have had an extension, a short extension, but there's a lot of uncertainty with that extension. So there's a lot that is happening in terms of shocks. So the weather shocks that we are anticipating will be an add-on to these protracted shocks. It's not just a single shock that we'll be dealing with if it does come through at the time of our summer season. Next slide, please. So just to give you a narrative of where we are in this just past marketing season, for 22-23 marketing year, we had very good supply levels, and demand was met from within the region. We want to emphasize that the carryover stocks do make a difference. You see in that top chart, the blue section of that histogram represents the harvest for the year, and the red portion of that histogram represents the opening stocks. So our opening stocks makes a very significant difference. In the case that our harvest can't meet the requirements, we do rely on what we carry over from the previous season. I think this is the point that Q mentioned in her presentation. The figure at the bottom there showing the self-sufficiency levels within the region is the normal situation when everything, the rainfall season is normal. We can see from that figure that Zambia and South Africa had a large surplus. Tanzania, Malawi, and Mozambique had a minor surplus. The rest of the countries had a deficit. But when you look at what has happened during the last part of this marketing year, this huge surplus that was anticipated in Zambia did not turn out to be that huge. Zambia has actually closed borders to exports to its neighbors. So that classification may have had to be revised from a large to a low surplus. So going forward, with respect to the anticipated weather shock, these countries are likely to be in deficit conditions. Both Zambia, Malawi, DRC, South Africa, they're likely to be in deficit if you follow what happened in 2015-16 production season. Next slide. So this slide shows the direction of trade flows from some of the surplus countries to the deficit countries. This is what happens in a normal season. South Africa exporting to the Botswana, Namibia, Eswatini, Lesotho countries, also to Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And South Africa also exporting to the rest of the world. Lately, we have seen exports from South Africa going into Kenya. Kenya this year has been importing maize from Southern Africa, from Zambia, directly via Tanzania, and also Zambia via Malawi, Tanzania. But most recently, we have seen exports from South Africa to Kenya. In a situation of El Nino conditions, these flows will not appear. I think it's very important to note that the flows outside the region will be reversed. We will be anticipating flows from outside the region into our region, mostly from countries such as Argentina. If we have a strong El Nino, we will definitely be expecting flows from South America into our region. One other fact to note is during this past marketing year, we had exports that were comparable for South Africa, that is, to what we exported in 21-22 production season. So what has really changed this past marketing year is the export of white maize. The volumes were ramped up because of participation of Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador. In our market, they were importing white maize from South Africa. The main point here is our starting levels, our carryover stock from the previous marketing year is anticipated to be much lower than we had expected. So we are likely to enter 23-24 marketing year with near average to below average carryover stocks. Next slide, please. So this chart, and apologies, I didn't label my left axis there. We are dealing with thousands of metric tons. So apologies, colleagues. SIPO, I'll send you revised charts that you'll be able to share with the rest of the participants. But we are measuring thousands of metric tons for the region. This is the regional aggregate supply based on the balance sheet estimates we get from countries. And these estimates include Tanzania and Southern DRC. So the blue part of these histograms show the harvest, and the red part shows the carryover stocks. As I mentioned, the carryover stocks do make a difference in our aggregate supply. The 2016-2017 marketing year, you can see the level of aggregate supply we had. The harvests were near 20,000 for the region, but we had more than 4 million metric tons that we were able to add to the 20 million of harvest in following the 2015-16 El Nino season. This was our lowest harvest in this period that we have in this graph, and it was a follow-up from also a poor 2014-15 production season. So two things. Number one, the carryover stocks are going to matter in terms of aggregate supply. And the second issue is we may have not just one season. It could be 2 or more poor seasons, as indicated in this graph. If we have a mild El Nino, it could be followed by another mild or even a stronger El Nino. So we need to start thinking ahead of time. Next slide, please. So this chart, again, apologies for the missing the label on the axis there. What I have done here is to position the harvest, the regional harvest, relative to the requirements. The gray, line graph shows what we require as a region, both for human and industrial utilization. For South Africa, the requirements also include exports. So this graph is showing that for a number of years, our harvests often do not meet our requirements. So it's important to have reserves to cushion us against poor harvests. In the case of 2015-16 and 16-17 marketing year, our requirements were way above our harvest. But thanks to the good carryover stocks, our reserves were able to cushion us. But specifically for 2016-17, our reserves were not even enough. We had to import grain from the region, from outside the region. But we have, even 2019-20, we had the mild El Nino, and our harvest was also below our requirements. and we needed to resort to our reserves. So the point again here, we need to have reserves. I know we have had a lot of debates about the importance of reserves and what those reserves should actually, be made of. But reserves are required. They are very critical for our food security. Next slide, please. So I've shown on this chart the levels of deficit if we compare our requirements versus our harvests. It shows that there are years when we have deficits. For example, 2015-16, the El Nino 2016-17 marketing year. These are marketing years, colleagues. And then the 2019-20 marketing year. We had deficit years. And the 16-17, following the El Nino, our reserves were much less than our deficit. So we had to import to meet our requirements. So the important thing about importing a grain is our ports have limited capacity. For example, we were short of nearly 8 million metric tons of maize following the El Nino in 2015-16 production season. Our ports can only allow 5 to 6 million metric tons. So our roads also have limited capacity. Our borders can only handle so much. So depending on the intensity and severity of the anticipated El Nino, it's very important that importation starts very early. As Q mentioned, timing can make a huge difference. We need to start positioning our stocks where we need them. And in some instances, we know countries tend to impose export restrictions, even within countries, movement of staple foods within countries becomes a problem. So our region has these difficulties of allowing free movement of grain across borders or across districts within the same country. And I think we need to start engaging and allow for freer access within countries and between countries. The other important issue to remember is demand has also increased, given that incomes have improved. So we are likely to see severe impacts of these shocks because of an increased demand for food. So colleagues, this is my last slide, just to emphasize that we need to keep our borders open. Movement of grain should be freer, and let us, lobby for grain stocks to be filled ahead of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jones, for that very interesting historical perspective and what impacts we are likely to see going forward with the forecasted El Nino especially given our current carryover stocks, implications if we have a strong El Nino or a weak El Nino, and possibly another 2 or 3 more years of El Nino of different strengths. Thank you for your key messaging and analysis. It's very appreciated. Colleagues, any questions for Jones, either in the chat or here?
Amjad has one.
Amjad, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for this. One quick question, like the carryover and deficit analysis, particularly in 2021-22, what I could see is, more than 6,000 in terms of surplus. And then the carryover looks a bit less than that. And then how suddenly with such a huge, carryover, now we are expecting or seeing a deficit at this point in time. Do we have enough analysis or evidence of, storage capacity of, these stocks? Thank you.
Yes. Would you want me to address the question?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Amjad, the issue of storage capacity is very, very important. Obviously, the quality of storage differs in different administrative and country levels. So in terms of permanent storage, we have limitations. Silos have limited capacity in our region. As we know, a lot of silos were developed more than 50 years ago. And the maintenance has been an issue. Some countries do have silos that are non-operational, that need to be worked on to bring them to utilization. There's been a lot of use of temporary storage to accommodate some of these surpluses. But we need to stock up, and that operation will require good storage. So your point is very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Jones. Amjad, is that fine, or do you have a follow-up question?
Oh, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions, Esipo? Comments? No. Thank you, Jones, for that excellent presentation. All right, the next agenda item. We're moving on to our nutrition update. Marjorie, are you online?
Yes, I am.
Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. And just confirming, you can hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
All right. So I'll be making the presentation on behalf of UNICEF and WFP, basically on the current nutrition situation and actions that are currently ongoing across the various countries. Next slide. So this slide gives in terms of the summary on where we are at in terms of the SAM programming. So this is management of severe acute malnutrition. And as you can see, we are really seeing an increase in the admission specifically in Angola and Zambia, if you compare it for 2022. But for some of the countries currently, we are really seeing a slight decline in terms of admission trends. So specifically for Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Madagascar, as well as Namibia. And just to highlight, within the region, we are really seeing a mix because we have countries that are already recovering from some of the crises, but also we have some of the potential crisis that is currently ongoing, though really not at scale, but with the anticipation that if the situation is really not contained, then we might be seeing an increase in the number of children that are admitted for severe acute malnutrition. Next slide. So this is just to show in terms of what we have seen. I think the first one I had already highlighted in terms of we are really, malnutrition still remains of concern. And of course, due to both the climatic risk as well as the disease outbreaks where we are still continuing and managing the cholera cases across, but also in terms of the macroeconomic conditions that are really having an impact on the provision of the nutritious diets for households. For some of the countries, we have seen a little bit of relief, but this is not, it is still early to celebrate, specifically with Angola in some of the areas, and based on just the preliminary results from the recent analysis, we are actually seeing a little bit of a decline in terms of the prevalence of acute malnutrition, but specifically, we still have some hotspots that we are likely to see an increase in the acute malnutrition. But in terms of both for the ongoing programming as well as in preparedness for the El Nino, most of the countries have now secured the supplies, and we have been able to preposition some of the supplies. So specifically for Malawi, currently Mozambique, we have nutrition supplies as well as Madagascar. The gaps really remain in Angola and Zimbabwe, where we still have to see, we are seeing a high funding gap with regards to nutrition. So basically, our key message is still we really need to continue our programming and specifically scaling up the multi-sectoral response, because these are the only prevention actions that can help us manage the caseload, and also in terms of just ensuring sustained funding for nutrition. Next slide. So I will go briefly in just some of the country snapshots. And for Angola specifically, what I had highlighted, so we are still pending the final validated data results, but hopefully that once these results from the SMART surveys have been approved and validated, we'll be able to share with you the results. But just to indicate that still for UNICEF specifically, as well as for WFP, we're still continuing to support both in terms of the capacity actions, but also in terms of the procuring of the supplies where need to be. But just to highlight, even for the procurement of UNICEF of the 20,000 RUTF, this is not enough. It can only be able to sustain around 3 months of programming. So essentially, I think our key message is in terms of continued resource mobilization for Angola and ensuring that there is enhanced accountability across the other sectors, but also enhanced accountability from the government. Next slide. So looking at Namibia, so Namibia is one of the countries that we are seeing a slight increase in the number of admissions when compared to last year in 2022, so 2021 and 2022. And basically, as such, the goodness with Namibia, it is neat. The numbers are still very small, but compared to the country level capacity, the increase is slightly huge. And noting that it's one of the countries that we really don't get to see a lot of implementation from the partner side. But basically, UNICEF, WFP, and partners are continuing to support, the implementation of nutrition actions, and specifically the vulnerability assessment that is planned for. We hope that we might be able to get more visibility in terms of the results, but also to help us identify some of the hotspots where we can be able to address some of the nutrition gaps. But essentially, just to indicate that the current response for Namibia, it includes both addressing some of the migrants from Angola, but also looking at responding to both flights and also the effects of food insecurity in some of the districts. Next slide. So moving on to Madagascar. So Madagascar, as we indicated, so we had a smart survey that was done in the south. The prevalence of the global acute malnutrition was around 9.2, which is, of course, below the emergency threshold. So far, we only have 5 out of 11 districts that have been classified in the serious phase. And for the Southeast, currently we have the smart surveys that is ongoing. So of course, with this, we'll be able to plan the actions accordingly. But if you look at in terms of the admission trends, still for this year, we are not seeing high admission trends when compared to the other years. But just to highlight for Madagascar, it's still one of the areas that we are continuing to strengthen our monitoring and surveillance, and just to make sure that we get to identify the hotspots and address some of the nutrition vulnerabilities as they emerge. Next slide. So moving on to Malawi specifically. So Malawi overall, we are seeing a slight decrease in the admission trends, so it's just around 22%. But just to highlight, again, this is probably at the beginning of the year, we really had a scaled up response, just starting from the late last year, we had upscaled response as part of the cholera response, but also in terms of preparation for the floods and cyclone. So far, in terms of the coverage, we'll say at least there is programming that is ongoing within the 28 districts, and priority is currently being given to around 15 districts, which have been considered at risk, especially when you look at in terms of prioritization for both the floods as well as for the cholera. But on the overall, just to look at for UNICEF specifically, we have really intensified our efforts. More support has come in, especially in terms of ensuring screening and identification of the children at the community level, and ensuring that there is a systematic referral of those children to the relevant programming. What we are currently looking at is optimizing and looking at different strategies of identifying and referring the children, and of course specifically looking at how we can be able to expand the family work, noting that one thing that we have noted for Malawi, the children coming into the facilities for treatment remain fewer, and that could be also one of the key indicators of the low admission rate that we are seeing. But again, I think in terms of optimizing the family work as well as comprehensive screening, then we might be able to see an increase in the number of children that have been being admitted. Again, just to highlight for Malawi specifically, we are noting on the overall decline in some of the prevention actions, including the support for infant and young child feeding, as well as deterioration of maternal nutrition. And so for this regards, we are looking at ways in which we can engage both the communities through this SBC approaches, so that we can enhance the IYCF as well as the maternal nutrition. For in terms of the funding, just to indicate, we are underfunding from the programming side, but just to indicate, at least for the supplies, we are clear up to September. What is really missing is the complementary support, especially for the community level actions. Next. Is just for Mozambique specifically, programming still is continuing for both the cyclone response as well as the conflict in the north. Again, just to indicate within the specifically for the north, one of the key things that we have been doing is to look at how we can be able to integrate nutrition actions and ensuring that the most vulnerable children are met. And that's why in the north we have really activated the MAMI. So this is management of infants who are malnourished, and looking at, because we noted that this is one of the key gaps specifically in addressing early identification of the children. But essentially this is activities are currently ongoing, and of course the scaling up of both prevention and treatment actions with support from UNICEF and WFP. The last just 2 countries is to look at Zambia and Zimbabwe. Next slide. So for Zambia, not so much to say, but just to indicate the programming is currently ongoing. We really don't have much triggers and much, much gaps in terms of the overall response. Just to indicate, of course, for the overall programming, we are continuing well, though we have really enhanced our surveillance just to make sure that, of course, there is no programming gaps. The country has really highlighted gaps, but in terms of the nutrition funding, but we are looking at in terms of optimizing for any response, specifically using the ongoing programming, the development programming, but also in terms of leveraging on other sectoral response capacity. Then the last slide, just in terms of Zimbabwe, and for Zimbabwe specifically, one of the key things for Zimbabwe is just to highlight, yes, we are really seeing a decline in the number of children that are malnourished, but just to indicate for Zimbabwe specifically, we really have a very huge funding gap. It still remains around 79% of the budget that had been projected for nutrition interventions in 2023. At least we have some funding in the pipeline to cover the supplies, but overall for programming specifically at the community level really remains a gap. And if we are looking at possibility of the impact of El Nino, then of course this is one of the countries that remains of surveillance, and we look at in terms of how we can be able to put together anticipatory actions to minimize the impact of risks to the children and women in Zimbabwe. So that's it, and over to you.
Thank you, Marjorie, for your excellent and detailed presentation. Let's see if there are any questions online from participants or any comments that need to be addressed. Any questions from people here, from members? No. Marjorie, I think your presentation was excellent and detailed, and there are no follow-up questions. So people can, if they have any second thoughts, they can put it into the chat, and I know you are always available to answer those questions. Thank you. All right, colleagues. I know we usually don't profile gender-based violence in our usual presentations, but because our interventions for drought can have, different GBV implications. And the way we design our responses or our interventions should be done very consciously, taking into consideration gender issues and the implications on, on gender and other issues. So I'm going to hand over to Christine from UNFPA to deliver a presentation on GBV risk mitigation in food security and nutrition. So over to you, Christine, and thank you for making time for our FNSWG in Southern Africa.
Thank you, everyone, and I'm really excited for this opportunity. Let me begin by saying that UNFPA is the lead agency for coordinating gender-based violence interventions in humanitarian IDP settings. So I am part of the team that executes this interagency coordination mandate for UNFPA. We do know that women are often responsible for household level food consumption in times of peace and during a crisis, and I think that is something that is widely known. So my presentation would really focus more around sharing with you the trends we are seeing in the region, in this region, but specifically showing the link between drought, food security, and gender-based violence. And overall, we do know that gender-based violence has a huge impact on agricultural productivity and resilience of survivors and their families. For instance, a woman
who is physically injured will not be able to actively engage in agricultural activities, thus affecting the productivity. But we also do know that majority of women and girls resort to negative coping strategies such as transactional sex, child marriage, etc. And as already someone has hinted, poorly designed food security and agriculture interventions can unintentionally create new risk or even worsen existing GBV risk, especially if we do not take time to analyze the sociocultural context, but also the specific protection risk that may be imminent in a particular setting. And there are two main publications by FAO, 2018 and 2017, that I would encourage you to read because it highlights in details the link between GBV, food security, and agricultural productivity. Next slide, please. So what are we seeing in the region? Adolescent girls continues to be one of the most vulnerable groups. And in Somalia and Kenya, for example, we're seeing a number of girls dropping out of school. And this is mainly to have them enter into early marriages or undergo female genital mutilation or cutting, but also to have them either engage in domestic labor or sex work as a means of earning additional income to support the family food needs. But also number of respondents from female-aided households are victims of sexual exploitation and abuse during food and non-food items distribution. And this is because of the lack of social and physical, protective factors or the safety nets. And this has been highlighted in assessments done in Somalia and Kenya. Also, since the drought began in Kenya, there is a reduction in the purchasing powers of households. And when the purchasing powers of households reduces, it limits access to family planning and contraceptive services. I'm imagining that many of you are wondering why, I'm bringing the issues of contraceptives and family planning and what's the link with GBV. But we do know that when households are unable to afford food, then they have to prioritize what they spend money on. And that means that spending money on family planning or contraceptive services would be the least priority. So this would then lead to unintended pregnancies. So when there are more babies, coming in, this means there are additional mouths, to feed. So this can actually result into a cyclical engagement in sexual exploitation, transactional sex for households, especially the women and girls, to be able to access basic commodities, including menstrual hygiene packs. Next. In Ethiopia, UNICEF have highlighted about 119% increase in child marriages, and with some girls as young as 12 years old in some of the worst drought-affected communities in Ethiopia. And this was highlighted in the UNICEF assessment that was done in June 2012. In terms of sexual violence, and I'm looking at in Kenya, where I'm based, in Samburu County, about 70% of household who are respondents in an assessment, they feel exposed to gender-based violence because they have to walk long distances to collect water. Because when there is drought, then the water level also reduces. And this means that women, but also girls who are often relegated to fetch water have to walk in the dark to collect water when probably there is less crowd. In terms of female genital mutilation, we have observed about 98% prevalent rates of female genital mutilation in most of the counties in Kenya that are affected by drought. And most of these girls are at risk of being cut. And we know whenever girls are cut, it means they are ready, they can be married off, anytime. So this is one of a huge risk. And this prevalence is actually higher than the national prevalence rate. Next slide. So, and just want to also highlight some other, studies and assessments or reports that have been done that speaks to this topic. So in 2022, again in Kenya, girls as young as 11 and 12 who are living in drought-affected counties were actually exploited sexually by older men in exchange for food, water, money, and sanitary products. And this was a report from Plan International in 2022. I already spoke about the FGM rate, so I will not repeat the second bullet on the female genital cutting. But in Somalia, it's the same trend that we are seeing: women exchanging sex for food and other basic households during drought. Again, with same as Kenya, Somalia has also seen increase in female genital cutting from 4 to 6% between 2019 and 2021 during the drought. Next. And looking at the sub-Saharan Africa, that is beyond our region, there was a study that was done across 19 countries in the region. And this study found out that drought was associated with 29% increase in reports of sexual violence and 15% increase in reports of physical violence compared to non-drought settings. And I've included the link to the study. It would be good if I can actually read. There were also reports in 2020 in Karamoja region, Northeast Karamoja region, where a region that faces cyclical drought, where United Nations staff who are based in the area were accused of demanding sex from women and girls in receipt of humanitarian assistance. I'll jump to the next slide. So in terms of nutrition, we do know that, and I think research continues to show that girls who are married off, who become mothers, are more likely to have underweight and malnourished babies. And I think UNICEF has done a number of studies and research, including in South Sudan, that highlights a very strong linkage between gender-based violence and nutrition. Next slide. So I would like us to watch a short video, which we recently did on Mozambique. So this video shows how our gender-based violence AOR coordinator in Mozambique is working with the food security cluster in Mozambique to mitigate risk of GBV. I don't know if you can play the video, Sipo.
Hi, Christine. Would you be okay if we shared the video with members after the meeting? We're a little bit behind on.
Okay. All right. That's fine then. So I can go to the next slide. Just concluding.
Yes. Please, can you conclude? Thank you.
Yes, so basically we have been working with the Food Security and Nutrition Working Group for East and Central Africa region since 2020. And we have been doing a number of activities collaboratively. And just to highlight that, now we do have the Food Security and Nutrition Working Group integrating GBV-specific advocacy in their advocacy engagement with donors, but also the drought bulletins and briefings. And for the first time ever, we convened a regional webinar on GBV risk mitigation in nutrition programming in January, together with the Food Security and Nutrition Working Group. Next slide. We also commissioned development of a learning brief on GBV risk, food security, and integrated food security classification. So this targets both food security and GBV actors. So I would also encourage members to really read this. I've included the link. The last slide. So this is just a question for reflection for all of us. How do we generate information on the impact of food security on women and girls? That goes beyond the IPC household analysis to inform food security interventions, because we do know that food security affects different members of the households differently. And I would like to end with a quote from a senior gender advisor for WFP, once Jacqueline Powell, who said, in reality, not everyone in the same household consumes the same amount or quality of food, or has the same coping strategies, or is empowered equally to make decisions. If we can let go of these patriarchal, archaic notions about the household, we will go a long way in having better data. I hope we can reflect on this in reference to how we do food security analysis. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Christine. Any questions? I do have a question, but I know in the interest of time, I will keep it short. But let's see if there's anyone online that has any question or any comments. Any feedback for Christine? You want, could I go ahead? Christine, we have our IPC coordinator here for Southern Africa. So the question you raised on IPC and GBV, I'm sure he's the best person to answer that.
I'm not sure if it is answering, but yes, I think that question you made or you posed is very important one. And I'm happy to advise that at a global level, even at regional level, IPC can now do what we call disaggregated analysis. That includes gender analysis. Namibia has indicated they want that type of analysis, but the challenge is not on the IPC itself. The challenge is on the data. It has to be representative at that particular level, at women and girls. So most surveys are not representative at that particular unit of analysis. So yes, we can still do. They're called household analysis groups in IPC, and you can still do that. But the problem is, where do you get that data disaggregated, that analysis? The other question that I have for you, interesting one, is on the female mutilations. I'm trying to see how they're linked. You say there's been an increase in some cases, more than 90% in some of the counties. And I wanted to link that to a normal year and look in terms of the age groups of these ladies that are mutilated. Has there been a shift? Are we seeing younger girls getting the cuttings, or they are still within the average age group where they get these mutilations? The second one is I don't know, maybe it's cultural within those counties. What has been the trend in terms of the average age for marriages? I hope you heard that. It is not a lot. I'm just thinking. I didn't process. I didn't have time to process.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Absolutely, I do acknowledge the challenges with having data that enables, disaggregation of data in terms of gender, age. And probably my question would be, how, if there is that challenges, then how can IPC actors or food security work with GBV actors and gender actors to maybe see where there might be gaps in information and see where, what could possibly be done. I know CARE International is doing a pilot currently in Somalia on integrating gender in the IPC, and hopefully, we look forward to really seeing what comes out of that. But also at the global level, I know the gender working group under it is looking into that. So then in terms of the FGM, I may have to connect with our team working on FGM to understand if there are, if younger girls are being cut. But basically, in my opinion, I would assume that most of the younger girls are ending up being cut because it is female genital cutting is strongly linked to being prepared to marry. So we cannot, we can look at it in connection with child marriage, which we know that when there's a drought and there's a food insecurity, shortage of food, families, strives to really reduce the number of mouths, that are fed. So having girls drop out of school and being cut is probably in preparing them to get married. In terms, and I think the same goes for the average age of child marriage. I think what we are seeing in many reports that are coming out, I think we're seeing girls as early as, as young as 11 and 12, and I think that is really very young, being married off. I hope that answers your questions.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all right. I think we can
do it
bilaterally. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Christine. I have one question, but I'm not going to expect an answer now. I think we can have a bilateral as well. My question is that, based on all the risks that you mentioned, the GBV implications related to drought, if, during your research, you have come across one particular action or one particular intervention that can actually mitigate these risks or reduce the risk, what would that be, from your research? Is it cash? And if it's cash, at what particular time should it be distributed to households, who particularly, obviously, female-headed households, who within the household should have the cash? This type of information, I think it's important for our planning and for anticipatory action protocols, but I will reach out to you for a bilateral on this. What particular action, if you would recommend, and the timing of that action that can significantly reduce these GBV risks. But I'll get back to you on that one. I know it's a lot to ask for now. Hopefully we can talk about that next week, if that's okay with you.
Thank you. I think that's fine. Let's have a bilateral because there are a myriad of interventions that might work in different contexts. So looking forward to having further conversation.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you. So on that note, we move to our final agenda item and we have 5 minutes, but it was worth the wait. Colleagues, I know you can't see me, it's really odd. You're seeing a voice, you've been seeing a voice all this time, but you haven't been seeing me, or you haven't been seeing Sipho as well, that's been sitting on that side. But we're going to introduce the next co-chair of the Regional Food and Nutrition Security Working Group. For the last months, we have been following our guidelines for the NGO co-chair of the FNSWG. FuseNet's term, 2-year term, comes to an end this month, and FuseNet will then officially hand over to the new co-chair next month. But by following the very strict protocols and rules of the FNSWG, it is my pleasure to welcome Maxwell Sibensana, if you can see him now, our very, very active member of the FNSWG from World Vision International, as our next co-chair of the FNSWG. So if you can give a virtual applause, and we will do a physical applause here to officially welcome Maxwell as the next co-chair of the FNSWG. We will be sharing with you a profile of Maxwell, and I trust that you would give him a warm welcome as well. So thank you, Maxwell. Do you have a few words for us?
Just to say thank you for affording World Vision the opportunity to act in this role. But my view is that the vibrance of the working group is not so much based on what the co-chairs do, but in what contributions come from the different members, and not just within meetings, but also in the preparation and in the submission of the content that is worth sharing.
Thank
so
you.
I'm looking forward to seeing all members making a contribution to making this a worthwhile working group here.
Thank you. Thanks. Very, very good remarks. And, you know, a reminder to all of us that the partnership actually makes the FNSWG. So thank you so much, Maxwell. And thank you, everyone on board. Lots of congratulations coming in for you, Maxwell. A lot of support, as we all know. Thanks, colleagues. And we will keep in touch for the next meeting. So have a good day and a good month. Thank you and all the best. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Yes.
That's people, by the way, for the new members. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.